Welcome back to News for Today, the show where we dive deep past the headlines and into the context that truly matters. I'm your host, James, and today we're tackling a subject that sounds like it's pulled straight from a political thriller, but is very real: the potential domestic use of the U.S. military, specifically the Insurrection Act. Joining me to unpack this complex piece of American law and recent political history is Elena, our resident expert analyst on executive power and constitutional law. Elena, thank you for being here.
James, it's great to be back. It's a heavy topic, but an incredibly necessary one right now, especially given the history we saw unfold, or almost unfold, in 2020.
Exactly. We know that during the George Floyd protests in Minneapolis in the summer of 2020, President Trump actively considered invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy thousands of active-duty military troops onto American streets. For listeners who might only vaguely recall that period, let's start with the basics. What exactly is the Insurrection Act of 1807, and why is its invocation such a momentous decision?
That's the key question. The Insurrection Act is essentially the legal pathway that allows a sitting president to deploy U.S. military forces, meaning active-duty federal troops, not just National Guard units controlled by state governors, for domestic law enforcement purposes. It's extremely old, dating back to Thomas Jefferson, and it serves as the primary legal exception to the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which generally prohibits the military from performing domestic police functions.
The Posse Comitatus Act is crucial there, right? It's the wall between the military and civilian life.
Precisely. The act mandates that the deployment can only happen when state authorities are unable or unwilling to suppress an insurrection, domestic violence, or conspiracy that hinders the execution of laws, making federal law enforcement impractical. It's supposed to be a tool of absolute last resort, used only when the civil order has completely collapsed. Historically, it's been used sparingly, during Reconstruction, sometimes during major civil rights crises, and sometimes for natural disaster relief, though those are different operational contexts.
So in 2020, based on what we know from reporting, the push to invoke the act was serious. He was reportedly considering deploying 10,000 active-duty troops. What was the internal pushback that stopped that invocation from happening?
The resistance was significant, James, and it came from the highest levels of the Pentagon and the Department of Justice. The two most public opponents were then Defense Secretary Mark Esper and Attorney General William Barr. Esper famously opposed using the Insurrection Act, arguing strongly that it should only be employed as a last resort, if ever, and he stressed the danger of normalizing the use of the military against American citizens. Barr also reportedly pushed back, arguing that federal law enforcement, specifically the marshals and the FBI, could handle the situation without crossing that line.
That's fascinating, because the optics alone, federal troops patrolling city streets, would be disastrous for civil liberties and public trust.
Absolutely. When you invoke the Insurrection Act, you fundamentally shift the concept of law enforcement in the area to military command. That means military rules of engagement, military jurisdiction over certain issues, and a blurring of the line between policing and warfare. It's a dangerous precedent because the act gives the president near absolute discretion in making the finding that the state is unable to cope. There's very little judicial review possible once that decision is made.
Right. Let's transition into the why it matters section, focusing on the future. We know that presidential campaigns, including the current Trump campaign, have indicated a willingness to use this power far more readily in a potential second term, possibly targeting border security, drug cartels, or ongoing domestic protests. If this tool moves from a rare constitutional emergency measure to a routine presidential option, what does that do to the American political landscape?
It dramatically increases the temperature of political dissent. The first casualty is the right to protest peacefully. If the immediate response to large-scale political protest is the threat or actual deployment of active-duty soldiers, that has a chilling effect on the First Amendment. It militarizes political disputes.
It also drags the military itself into politics, which they traditionally resist fiercely.
Precisely. The military sees itself as apolitical, dedicated to protecting the Constitution and foreign interests. Forcing them into domestic policing roles against their fellow citizens fundamentally politicizes the armed forces, damaging unit cohesion and public trust in the institution. It transforms domestic disputes into security crises, creating a slippery slope toward authoritarian applications of force. We saw this concern clearly in 2020, where many senior military leaders expressed extreme discomfort with their potential role.
That's a good point. Let's move to some fictional listener questions we've gathered. The first one asks, if the Insurrection Act is invoked, what checks and balances remain on the president's power?
That's a tough question because the checks are extremely limited in practice. Constitutionally, Congress could try to repeal the invocation through legislation, but that would almost certainly face a presidential veto, requiring a two-thirds majority to override. The Supreme Court has historically been hesitant to interfere with the president's constitutional role as commander-in-chief during what he defines as an emergency. So, realistically, the primary check is political and structural, the resistance from cabinet members, the Pentagon, and public opinion. Once the military is deployed, the president holds tremendous operational power.
Wow. Okay. Second question. Could the Insurrection Act be used to bypass state governors entirely if they refuse to cooperate with federal mandates, say on issues like border enforcement or perhaps public health measures?
The short answer is yes. That's exactly the power it grants. The entire point of the Insurrection Act is to supersede state authority when the federal government determines that state authorities are failing to uphold federal law or protect civil rights, or more vaguely, are unable to deal with domestic violence. If a governor says, we don't need or want federal troops, but the president determines that an insurrection or disruption exists that prevents the execution of laws, the president wins that argument under the Insurrection Act. It completely overrides the governor's jurisdiction over those deployed federal forces. That is the raw power we are discussing.
That's incredibly sobering context, Elena. The idea that a law from 1807 holds such potential influence over our modern political and military structure is truly remarkable.
It is. It's a reminder that these old legal tools are dormant, not dead, and they can be reactivated with serious consequences if political norms erode around them.
Elena, thank you so much for bringing clarity and crucial context to this discussion about the Insurrection Act. It's clear that this is a topic we all need to monitor closely as we move forward.
My pleasure, James.
And that wraps up this deep dive into presidential power and the Insurrection Act. We hope this episode has provided you with the necessary framework to understand why this specific piece of legislation is generating so much attention and concern among legal scholars and civil rights advocates. Thank you for tuning in to News for Today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review, and we will catch you in the next episode.